The snow fell heavy over Dzerzhinsky Square that January morning, muffling the sound of footsteps approaching the imposing yellow façade of the Lubyanka. Inside, in a third-floor office devoid of warmth or decoration, Major Yuri Modin sat reviewing a dossier that would change the course of Cold War espionage. The file was thin, deceptively so. A photograph clipped to the first page showed a young man in his mid-20s, lean, intellectual, with wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that suggested both ambition and doubt. His name was David Greenglass. No, that wasn't right. Modin corrected himself. The real name didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the code name scribbled in red ink at the top, Spectrum. Modin had been tasked with something unprecedented. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, had determined that the battleground of the Cold War would not be won solely with missiles or tanks. It would be won with words, narratives, and the slow, methodical poisoning of truth. The Americans had their newspapers, their radio broadcasts, their Hollywood dream factories. The Soviet Union needed to infiltrate that machinery, not with crude propaganda, but with subtlety. They needed someone inside the most trusted institution in American journalism, the New York Times. The man in the photograph had been identified 2 years earlier during a routine sweep of American Communist Party sympathizers. He was a freelance journalist, writing for small progressive magazines in New York, attending lectures on Marxist theory in cramped Brooklyn apartments, and quietly nursing a resentment toward the capitalist machine that had crushed his immigrant parents. His father, a garment worker, had died in a factory fire that made no headlines. His mother cleaned offices on Wall Street, invisible to the men in suits who passed her every morning. The young journalist had watched America's promises crumble into hypocrisy, and the KGB had noticed. But recognizing a potential asset was only the first step. Recruitment required precision, patience, and an understanding of human psychology that bordered on the surgical. Modin knew that ideological fervor alone was not enough. True agents who could survive for decades under deep cover needed something more, a belief that they were not traitors but heroes. They needed to see themselves as soldiers in a righteous cause, correcting the lies of an empire built on exploitation. The approach began in Paris, far from the watchful eyes of the FBI. The young journalist had been invited to cover a leftist cultural conference, an event subsidized, unknowingly to most attendees, by Soviet front organizations. It was there that he met André, a charming French intellectual who spoke fluent English and seemed genuinely interested in his work. Over wine and cigarettes in a café near Saint-Germain-des-Prés, André spoke about the importance of truth in journalism, about how the American press was controlled by corporate interests, about how real change required courage and sacrifice. The conversations continued for months, always casual, always plausibly deniable. André introduced him to others, academics, writers, people who seemed connected to something larger. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the young journalist was drawn into a web of trust and shared conviction. By the time the proposition came framed not as espionage, but as informing the Soviet Union about distortions in the American media, it felt less like betrayal and more like duty. Back in Moscow, Modin finalized the operational plan. Spectrum would be inserted into the New York Times not through deception, but through merit. He would write, he would climb the ranks, he would become indispensable. The KGB would provide financial support through untraceable channels, editorial suggestions disguised as intellectual guidance, and when necessary, information that would make his reporting seem prescient. In return, he would do 3 things: identify which stories the CIA was planting in the press, subtly shape coverage of Soviet affairs to soften American hostility, and most crucially provide the KGB with advanced knowledge of major investigative pieces that could threaten Soviet operations. It was a long game, and Modin knew it. The Americans were paranoid, Yes, but their paranoia was loud and blunt loyalty oaths, McCarthy hearings, clumsy surveillance. The KGB's approach was different. They understood that the best spies were not the ones who stole secrets in the night, but the ones who shaped reality in broad daylight. Spectrum arrived back in New York in the spring of 1952, carrying with him a new sense of purpose and a contact protocol so subtle it could pass for coincidence. Every 6 weeks, he would visit a particular bench in Central Park, carrying a copy of The New Yorker folded in a specific way. A stranger would sit beside him, and they would exchange a few words about the weather. Information would pass in microdots hidden in magazine advertisements, in subtle changes to submitted drafts, in conversations that seemed to be about nothing. By 1954, Spectrum had published his first piece in the New York Times, a well-researched article on labor movements in post-war Europe. It was clean, factual, and carried no obvious slant. The editors were impressed. He was invited to contribute more. Within 2 years, he was offered a staff position. By 1958, he had a desk on the 3rd floor of the Times building on West 43rd Street, a byline that carried weight, and the trust of colleagues who saw him as nothing more than a dedicated, if slightly reserved, journalist. And in Moscow, in a locked file cabinet in the Lubyanka, Major Yuri Modin added a single notation to the Spectrum dossier: asset active. Deep cover established. Duration indefinite. The Cold War had found a new battlefield, and the first shot had been fired in silence. The newsroom of the New York Times in 1961 was a symphony of controlled chaos. Typewriters clattered in uneven rhythm, phones rang incessantly, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the acidic smell of freshly printed ink. Reporters hunched over desks, cluttered with notes, racing against deadlines that came like waves, relentless and unforgiving. In the far corner, near a window overlooking the gray sprawl of Midtown Manhattan, sat a man the others knew simply as David Sherman, though that, too, was not his real name. Sherman was 43 now, with graying temples and the kind of wire-rimmed glasses that suggested intellectual seriousness. He had carved out a reputation as one of the paper's most reliable correspondents on Soviet affairs. His pieces were meticulously researched, balanced in tone, and devoid of the hysteria that often characterized American coverage of the USSR. Editors trusted him. Sources confided in him. Colleagues envied his access and his apparent ability to see through the fog of Cold War propaganda on both sides. What none of them knew was that every Thursday evening, after the newsroom began to empty and the late shift took over, Sherman would walk 8 blocks north to a small delicatessen on Lexington Avenue. He would order pastrami on rye, sit in the back booth, and leaf through a copy of The Nation while waiting. At precisely 7:15 p.m., another man would enter, sometimes in a gray overcoat, sometimes in a cheap suit, always unremarkable, and sit across from him. They would exchange a few words about city politics, about the weather, about nothing. And in those few minutes, information would pass between them with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The system had been refined over a decade. Sherman never carried classified documents, never photographed files, never did anything that could be traced back to espionage. Instead, he provided context, advance warnings, and strategic insight. He would inform his handler which stories the Times was preparing to publish about Soviet technology, which CIA sources were feeding information to rival papers, and most valuable of all, which investigations might expose KGB operations in the United States. In return, he received occasional tips from anonymous sources that made his reporting look brilliant. Financial support funneled through a fictitious inheritance from a distant European relative, and the quiet assurance that he was fighting the good fight. But the double life was not without its cost. Sherman lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the West Village, modest and cluttered with books. He had no close friends, no romantic entanglements that lasted more than a few months, no connections deep enough to threaten his cover. Loneliness was the price of the game, and he paid it without complaint. Every conversation was a performance, every relationship a calculation. Even his passion for journalism reel once had become a tool, a means to an end. The early 1960s were a dangerous time for a spy in America. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 had ratcheted up tensions, and the CIA was expanding its domestic counterintelligence efforts. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was obsessed with rooting out Soviet influence, and suspected journalists were under constant scrutiny. Sherman knew he was being watched, though he couldn't be sure how closely. He varied his routines, avoided known communist sympathizers, and maintained the appearance of a cynical but patriotic American who simply believed in honest reporting. In Moscow, the KGB was pleased. Spectrum had become one of their most valuable assets, not because he stole atomic secrets, but because he provided something far more useful, the ability to shape the American narrative before it was even published. When the Times prepared a major expose on Soviet submarine activity in the Atlantic, Sherman's advance warning allowed the KGB to relocate assets and prepare a disinformation campaign. When CIA operatives planted stories about unrest in Soviet satellite states, Sherman's reporting offered subtle counterpoints that sowed doubt without appearing propagandistic. But in 1962, everything changed. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation, and the American press was in a frenzy. Sherman found himself in the middle of the storm, writing piece after piece as the White House and the Kremlin played a deadly game of brinkmanship. For 13 days, the newsroom became a war room, and Sherman was forced to operate under a level of scrutiny he had never experienced. It was during this crisis that he came closest to exposure. A junior reporter, eager and ambitious, had noticed something odd. Sherman's sources for Soviet military movements seemed unusually well informed, and his interpretations of Khrushchev's intentions were often proven right within days. The young reporter mentioned it casually to an editor who dismissed it as paranoia. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Sherman felt the shift. He became more cautious, more withdrawn. His Thursday meetings were temporarily suspended, replaced by dead drops in locations scattered across the city, a hollowed-out brick in a Harlem alleyway, a false bottom in a trash can in Battery Park. The KGB instructed him to reduce contact, to let the heat die down. For 6 months, he operated in near isolation, feeding information through intermediaries he never met. And then, in the spring of 1963, a new handler arrived. His code name was Volkov, and he was different from the others, younger, more aggressive, less patient. Volkov believed that Spectrum was being underutilized, that the Times was a platform for more than passive intelligence gathering. He wanted Sherman to actively influence editorial decisions, to push certain narratives, to become not just an observer, but a shaper of American opinion. Sherman resisted. He had survived a decade by being invisible, by never overplaying his hand. But Volkov was insistent, and Moscow backed him. The Cold War was intensifying, and the KGB needed every advantage. Reluctantly, Sherman began to push harder, suggesting certain angles in editorial meetings, steering coverage toward stories that served Soviet interests, subtly undermining pieces that threatened the USSR's image. It worked for a time. But with every move, the risk grew. And in the shadows, unseen by Sherman, the FBI was beginning to close in. The year 1968 was a crucible for America. The Tet Offensive shattered illusions about Vietnam, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy were assassinated, and cities burned with rage and despair. The Cold War, once a distant abstraction of missiles and ideologies, had seeped into the streets, into living rooms, into the very fabric of daily life. And in the windowless basement of the FBI's New York field office, A small team of counterintelligence agents was methodically piecing together a puzzle that had eluded them for nearly 2 decades. Special Agent Thomas Calloway was 51, a veteran of the Bureau's Soviet division, and a man who understood that espionage was not a game of sudden revelations, but of patient accumulation. For 3 years, he had been tracking anomalies in the American press stories that seemed to anticipate Soviet moves. Articles that subtly softened unfavorable coverage of the USSR, investigative pieces that mysteriously stalled before publication. There was no smoking gun, no single piece of evidence, but a pattern was emerging. And at the center of that pattern was a name that kept appearing in CIA briefings: David Sherman. Sherman had become more prominent by 1968. His reporting on Soviet politics and Cold War diplomacy was considered essential reading in Washington. He had won a Pulitzer nomination for a series on the arms race, and his columns were occasionally cited in State Department policy discussions. To the world, he was a distinguished journalist at the height of his career. To Calloway, he was a ghost too perfect, too informed, too careful. The breakthrough came not from surveillance, but from a defector. In June 1968, a mid-level KGB officer named Viktor Lozhinov walked into the American embassy in Vienna and asked for asylum. Lozhinov had worked in the first Chief Directorate's Active Measures Department, responsible for disinformation and influence operations. During his debriefing, he mentioned an asset inside a major American newspaper code name, Spectrum, who had been operational since the early 1950s. Lozhinov didn't know the asset's real name, but he provided enough details. Male, mid-40s, Soviet affairs specialist, based in New York. The CIA passed the information to the FBI, and Calloway's team went to work. They cross-referenced travel records, financial transactions, and known KGB contacts in New York. Sherman's name surfaced repeatedly, but there was still no hard evidence. The Bureau needed to catch him in the act, and that required patience and a level of surveillance that bordered on obsessive. For Sherman, the late 1960s had become a waking nightmare. He could feel the walls closing in, though he couldn't identify the threat. His handler, Volkov, had been recalled to Moscow abruptly in 1967, replaced by a woman who used the code name Lena. She was colder, more cautious, and she brought troubling news. The KGB suspected that a mole hunt was underway in the American intelligence community, and assets were being instructed to minimize contact. Sherman's Thursday meetings had long since ended, replaced by sporadic dead drops and encrypted messages hidden in personal ads in obscure publications. But even these felt dangerous now. He began to notice small details, cars that appeared too often, faces that lingered too long in his peripheral vision, phones that clicked with a faint electronic hum. He wasn't sure if it was paranoia or genuine surveillance, but the effect was the same. A gnawing, constant fear that every word, every movement might be his last as a free man. In the newsroom, Sherman maintained his facade, but colleagues noticed changes. He drank more, slept less, and his once meticulous reporting had become erratic. An editor pulled him aside in October 1968, concerned. Sherman blamed stress, the chaos of the election, the weight of covering a world tearing itself apart. The editor accepted the explanation, but made a note to monitor his performance. Meanwhile, the FBI surveillance intensified. Calloway's team installed wiretaps on Sherman's home phone, photographed everyone who entered his building, and tracked his movements with rotating teams of agents. They knew they were close, but they needed undeniable proof: a meeting with a handler, a transfer of documents, something that would hold up in court. The trap was set in November. An FBI asset, posing as a low-level Soviet diplomat newly arrived in New York, made contact with Sherman through a mutual acquaintance in leftist intellectual circles. The approach was subtle, designed to seem accidental. Over several weeks, The asset built trust, hinting that he had information about Soviet internal politics that might interest Sherman professionally. Sherman was wary, but also desperate. His KGB contacts had gone silent, and he feared he was being abandoned. In late December, the asset suggested a meeting to exchange information. Sherman agreed, but insisted on a public location, a bar in the East Village, crowded and anonymous. The FBI was ready, with agents positioned throughout the venue and surveillance equipment hidden in the walls. The meeting took place on a cold Tuesday evening, 2 days after Christmas. Sherman arrived early, chose a corner table, and waited. The asset arrived 15 minutes later, carrying a briefcase. They spoke for nearly an hour, their conversation recorded by FBI microphones. The asset handed Sherman an envelope, explaining it contained documents about Soviet agricultural policy. Sherman glanced inside, then slipped it into his coat pocket. It was enough. As Sherman left the bar, agents moved in. He was arrested on the corner of 3rd Avenue and East 7th Street, surrounded by pedestrians who barely noticed as a quiet, gray-haired man in a wool overcoat was handcuffed and led into an unmarked car. The envelope he carried contained nothing classified, just routine statistics any journalist might possess. But the surveillance footage, the wiretaps, and the pattern of behavior built over 3 years told a different story. The FBI had their man. In Moscow, when word reached the Lubyanka that Spectrum had been arrested, there was no panic. The operation had lasted 20 years longer than anyone had expected. Files were purged, contacts were severed, and the agent's existence was quietly erased from official records. He had served his purpose. And in a holding cell in Lower Manhattan, David Sherman, who was not David Sherman, sat in silence, staring at the concrete walls, and wondered if he had ever really believed in anything at all. The trial of David Sherman became a spectacle that transfixed Cold War America. When news broke in January 1969 that a senior correspondent for the New York Times had been arrested on suspicion of espionage, the reaction was seismic. Politicians demanded investigations, rival newspapers scrambled to uncover what they had missed, and the American public struggled to reconcile the image of a trusted journalist with the reality of a Soviet spy operating in plain sight for 2 decades. The arrest sent shockwaves through every level of American society. In Washington, congressional committees convened emergency hearings. Senator James Eastland, chairman of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, called it the most devastating infiltration of American media since the Rosenberg case. The CIA and FBI found themselves under intense scrutiny. How had Sherman evaded detection for so long? What other compromises existed within the press corps? The paranoia that had defined the McCarthy era, seemingly dormant in the late 1960s, roared back to life with renewed fury. The New York Times, facing its gravest crisis since the Pentagon Papers would later emerge in 1971, moved swiftly to contain the damage. Sherman was suspended immediately, his desk cleared, his byline scrubbed from the next day's edition. The newspaper's publisher, Arthur Ochs Sulzberger, issued a statement expressing shock and betrayal while pledging full cooperation with federal investigators. An internal review was launched to determine how deeply his reporting had been compromised. A team of senior editors, working around the clock in a sealed conference room on the 11th floor, pored over thousands of articles spanning nearly 2 decades, searching for signs of bias, distortion, or leaked information. What they found was both chilling and difficult to quantify. Sherman's work was technically accurate, well-sourced, and professionally executed. His prose was clear, his facts verifiable, his interviews genuine. There were no obvious fabrications, no smoking gun moments of disinformation. But as the editors dug deeper, patterns emerged subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. A story angle that consistently portrayed Soviet technological achievements in favorable light. an omitted fact that would have undermined a Kremlin narrative, a tone that softened criticism of Soviet domestic repression while amplifying doubts about American intelligence claims, a strategic silence on stories that might have exposed KGB operations in the West. One editor, a 20-year veteran named Margaret Collins, described the experience as reading a novel where every sentence is grammatically correct, but the entire plot has been quietly rewritten. The manipulation was surgical, professional, and devastatingly effective. Sherman had not lied. He had simply shaped truth, bending it incrementally until it served another master. The federal trial began in March 1969 in the Southern District of New York, in the imposing Foley Square courthouse where Alger Hiss and Julius Rosenberg had once faced their accusers. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Hennessy, a former Marine Corps intelligence officer who had spent 3 years in counterespionage during the Korean War, faced a daunting challenge: proving espionage without access to the full scope of classified intelligence that had led to Sherman's arrest. Much of the FBI surveillance evidence remained sealed, deemed too sensitive to reveal in open court for fear of exposing ongoing operations against other Soviet assets. The evidence Hennessy could present was circumstantial but damning. Years of surveillance footage showing Sherman in proximity to known KGB operatives, though never directly meeting them. Financial irregularities, unexplained cash deposits totaling over $40,000 across 15 years, supposedly from a European inheritance that investigators could never verify. Testimony from the defector Viktor Lajanov, who had identified an asset codenamed Spectrum inside a major American newspaper. And most crucially, recordings of Sherman's final meeting with the undercover FBI agent posing as a Soviet diplomat, in which Sherman had accepted documents and discussed mutual interests in language that, while carefully ambiguous, suggested a relationship far deeper than journalistic source cultivation. Sherman's defense attorney Harold Wise, a passionate civil liberties advocate who had defended conscientious objectors during World War II and challenged loyalty oaths during the McCarthy era, argued that his client was a victim of government paranoia and McCarthyist overreach. Weiss was a silver-haired man in his 60s, possessed of a theatrical courtroom presence and a deep-seated distrust of federal power. He painted Sherman as a dedicated journalist whose only crime was refusing to conform to cold war hysteria, whose balanced reporting on the Soviet Union had made him a target for an FBI desperate to justify its existence in an era of détente. Weiss pointed out that no classified documents had ever been found in Sherman's possession, that he had never been caught photographing files or meeting with known KGB officers in circumstances that unambiguously indicated espionage, and that the so-called evidence was nothing more than the routine work of a foreign correspondent maintaining sources in a closed society. Every journalist who covers the Soviet Union, Weiss thundered during his opening statement, cultivates relationships with Soviet officials. Every journalist who writes about Moscow receives information from Soviet sources. Every journalist who seeks to understand our adversary must engage with their worldview. Are we now to criminalize the act of journalism itself because this government finds the resulting coverage insufficiently hostile? The courtroom was packed every day, journalists filling the gallery to witness one of their own on trial. The press corps was divided. Some saw Sherman as a traitor who had betrayed his profession, others as a scapegoat being sacrificed to appease political pressure. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered daily. A mix of anti-war activists who saw the trial as government persecution of dissent, and conservative groups carrying signs demanding the death penalty for treason. Sherman himself was a paradox throughout the proceedings, calm, articulate, and seemingly indifferent to his fate. He sat at the defense table in simple gray suits, taking notes during testimony, occasionally whispering to his attorney, but never showing emotion. When he took the stand in his own defense during the trial's fourth week, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. For 2 days, Sherman testified, and his performance was riveting. He denied being a Soviet agent, but he did not deny his sympathies. He spoke of growing up poor in Brooklyn during the Depression, of watching his father die in a factory fire that made no headlines because immigrant workers were expendable. He described his mother cleaning offices on Wall Street, invisible to the men in suits who passed her every morning without acknowledgement. He talked about attending City College on scholarship, discovering Marx and Engels, and realizing that the poverty and exploitation he had witnessed were not accidents but features of a system designed to concentrate wealth and power. "I believed then, and I believe now," Sherman said, his voice steady, "that American capitalism is fundamentally unjust. I believe that the Soviet Union, for all its flaws, and I am not blind to those flaws, represented an alternative to imperialism, a society that at least claimed to value labor over capital, collective welfare over individual greed. Does that make me a traitor? Or does it make me someone who dared to question the orthodoxy of American exceptionalism?" He admitted to knowing people with communist affiliations, to attending leftist meetings in the 1950s, to believing that the Cold War was a manufactured conflict perpetuated by military-industrial interests on both sides. But he insisted that his reporting had always been honest, that he had never knowingly aided a foreign power, and that his only loyalty was to the truth as he understood it. "If my crime," Sherman said on his second day of testimony, "is that I refuse to write propaganda disguised as journalism, then I plead guilty. But if the charge is that I betrayed my country by trying to help Americans understand the world as it actually exists, rather than as our government wishes us to perceive it, then I am innocent." It was a compelling performance, and it swayed some observers. But it wasn't enough. The prosecution's rebuttal was methodical and devastating. Hennessy introduced testimony from CIA analysts who explained, using declassified examples, how Sherman's reporting had consistently anticipated Soviet responses to American policy initiatives, not because of journalistic insight, but because he had advanced knowledge of Kremlin thinking. His articles had undermined confidence in intelligence assessments of Soviet military capabilities, creating political pressure that hampered defense appropriations. His access to editorial meetings at the Times had given the KGB advance knowledge of investigative stories that could have damaged Soviet interests, allowing Moscow to prepare countermeasures or eliminate compromised assets before exposure. The prosecution presented forensic analysis of Sherman's financial records, showing cash deposits that coincided precisely with major stories beneficial to Soviet interests. They documented trips to Europe, Paris, Vienna, Brussels that aligned with known movements of KGB operatives assigned to media cultivation. Handwriting experts testified that coded personal ads in obscure leftist publications matched Sherman's writing style, and cryptography specialists explained how these ads followed known Soviet communication protocols. The most damaging testimony came from Viktor Lodyanov, the defector who had first identified Spectrum. Lodyanov appeared via closed-circuit television from a secure location, his face obscured by electronic distortion to protect his identity. Speaking through a translator, though his English was fluent, Lodyanov described how the KGB, as first chief directorate, had specifically targeted major American media outlets in the early 1950s as part of a long-term strategy to influence Western public opinion. Spectrum, he testified, had been considered a model of deep-cover success, an agent so carefully managed, so professionally disciplined, that even high-ranking KGB officers knew the asset only by code name. Lodyanov explained the concept of active measures, the Soviet term for covert operations designed to influence foreign governments and public opinion through disinformation, front organizations, and media manipulation. The goal, Lodyanov said, was never to turn the New York Times into Pravda. That would be detected immediately. The goal was to make truth negotiable, to introduce doubt where there should be certainty. to make Americans question their own institutions and their own intelligence services. Spectrum did this brilliantly, not by lying, but by carefully selecting which truths to emphasize and which to bury. The defense fought back, challenging Loginov's credibility, suggesting he had fabricated information to secure his asylum, pointing out that he had never personally met Sherman or handled his case directly, but the damage was done. The jury, composed of 11 ordinary New Yorkers and one alternate, had heard enough. They deliberated for 3 days. On April 18, 1969, at 2:47 in the afternoon, they returned a verdict: guilty on 4 counts of conspiracy to commit espionage. Sherman was acquitted on the more serious charge of direct espionage. The evidence, the jury foreman later explained, did not conclusively prove he had transmitted classified information, but the conspiracy charges were sufficient. Judge Irving Kaufman, who had presided over the Rosenberg trial 17 years earlier, sentenced Sherman to 25 years in federal prison. Sherman showed no emotion as the sentence was read, simply nodding once before being led away by U.S. Marshals. But the story did not end there. In the years following the trial, questions lingered and deepened. Investigative journalists, initially constrained by the ongoing legal proceedings, began to dig deeper. FOIA requests filed in 1974, after Watergate had loosened government secrecy, unearthed partial FBI files that revealed the scope of surveillance Sherman had been under and suggested that other journalists might be under similar scrutiny. Former intelligence officials, retiring or seeking to settle old scores, began to speak more openly about the case in interviews and memoirs. What emerged was a more complex and troubling picture. Sherman had indeed been a KGB asset, but his role had been less about stealing secrets and more about shaping perception. He was part of a broader Soviet strategy known as active measures, the use of disinformation, influence operations, and media manipulation to weaken the enemy from within. Documents released decades later revealed that the KGB had at least 15 media assets in major Western publications during the 1960s, though most were never identified or prosecuted. The KGB had understood something fundamental about democratic societies that authoritarian regimes often missed. In a democracy, truth was not absolute. It was negotiated, constructed through the media, through public discourse, through the stories people told themselves about the world. By placing an agent inside the most trusted newspaper in America, they didn't just gain intelligence, they gained the power to subtly alter reality itself, to shape the narrative through which Americans understood their enemies and themselves. Sherman served 17 years at the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. By all accounts, he was a model prisoner, quiet, well-read, spending his days in the prison library. He refused all interview requests, wrote no memoir, and maintained his innocence to fellow inmates who asked. In 1986, as Cold War tensions began to thaw under Gorbachev, he was released as part of a prisoner exchange. One of 11 Americans and Soviets swapped in a carefully choreographed ceremony on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the Bridge of Spies, where Gary Powers and Rudolf Abel had been exchanged 24 years earlier. Sherman was flown to East Berlin, handed over to Soviet handlers, and disappeared into obscurity. Rumors surfaced occasionally in intelligence circles and among veteran Cold War correspondents that he was living in Moscow under a new identity, that he had written a memoir the KGB had suppressed, that he had grown disillusioned with the Soviet system he had served and spent his final years drinking in shabby apartments, abandoned by the cause he had sacrificed everything for. One unconfirmed report suggested he died alone in a Leningrad apartment in 1993. 2 years after the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist, the ultimate irony for a man who had believed so fervently in its promise. The New York Times never fully recovered its innocence. The paper implemented stricter background checks, mandatory financial disclosures, and regular counterintelligence briefings for correspondents covering sensitive regions. But the damage to institutional trust ran deeper than policy could address. The case became a cautionary tale cited in journalism schools and intelligence training programs as proof that the Cold War's true battleground had always been information itself. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. And in the end, the most unsettling question remained unanswered. If one spy could operate undetected for 20 years inside America's most respected institution, how many others were still out there, hidden in plain sight, shaping the stories we believe to be true? The question haunted intelligence agencies, newsrooms, and the public imagination for decades. Every controversial article, every unexplained leak, every journalist with unconventional views became suspect in some circles. A paranoia that itself served Soviet interests by undermining faith in American institutions. The Cold War had taught many lessons, but perhaps the most enduring was this: reality is not discovered, it is written. And whoever controls the pen controls the world. Sherman understood that. The KGB understood that. And by the time America understood it, the damage was already done. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who our enemies are, these narratives shape everything, from policy decisions to the course of history itself. In that sense, David Sherman's greatest espionage success was not the secrets he stole, but the doubts he planted, the certainties he eroded, the trust he betrayed. Those wounds, invisible but profound, lasted far longer than any prison sentence. As the 1970s gave way to détente and the Cold War's slow thaw, the Sherman case faded from headlines but never from memory. It remained a ghost story told in journalism schools, a warning whispered in intelligence briefings, a reminder that in the war for truth, the front lines run through every newsroom, every broadcast, every story we tell ourselves about the world. And in that war, the casualties are not counted in bodies, but in the slow erosion of the one thing democracies cannot survive without: the belief that truth still matters and that someone somewhere is still trying to tell it.